So here we have periwinkle. This is the bane of a lot of people. It's a plant that was brought over from Europe and often planted in shady areas, and it makes a nice ground cover, and you don't have to cut the grass, right? And it's beautiful. It's an evergreen, so as long as there isn't snow on the ground, it's green all year round, and it has these beautiful flowers in May and June, which are itself very aesthetically pleasing. The problem with it, though, is it spreads by runners, and it can be invasive. And sometimes, particularly in forest areas, you'll see in areas where it was planted in somewhat of a woodland area, or maybe it was planted around a house where there were trees, but eventually, long ago the house fell down, it was no longer being inhabited, and the area became more forest-like, and the periwinkle just spreads like crazy, and it crowds out other species. Now, to be honest with you, it's not that invasive, meaning it doesn't jump to other locations easily. It tends to be localized in the immediate area where it was planted, but in that immediate area, it can significantly crowd out other types of species that would normally grow in a shaded woodland environment. So for that reason, it is discouraged from being planted these days. But you'll often see it. If you're walking around in the woods and you see a big patch of celandine, if you're walking in the woods and you see a big patch of periwinkle, it usually means that somewhere in there you'll find the ruins of an old farm where it was originally planted in their gardens. Anyway, it's an amazing plant. Now, periwinkle, it's not native, but it grows in those areas where it was planted in the past. It's a very close relative of another type of periwinkle, Madagascar periwinkle, which is a plant from which a particular chemotherapy drug called Vinca is produced. Originally, it was produced. I would imagine by now they've learned how to make it synthetically. But the one of the things about the periwinkles is that they're very rich in alkaloids, which are a particularly potent group of plant chemical constituents upon which many of our drugs were originally derived. Back in the day when they first started to understand the chemistry of plants, a lot of the plants that they were primarily working with were alkaloid containing plants, because alkaloids produce very potent drugs. Think morphine, for example, or some of those chemotherapy drugs, or Syncona. I can't even remember the name of it right now. My mind's gone blank. But the main drug that they use for malaria, which comes from cinchona bark, from a tree that grows in Peru. Why can I not think of it? I don't know. Anyway, so the point being, they were looking for these alkaloids in plants. It's just one of the reasons why they focused a lot on tropical plants, because one of the things about tropical plants is they tend to produce a lot more alkaloids. And the reason is because in many areas, like in the jungle, they grow all year round. And among other things, one of the reasons they produce alkaloids is to discourage foraging by mammals and insects, because their leaves don't just drop in the fall and they produce a new crop in the spring. They want to keep as many of their leaves as possible, and a lot of these alkaloids they can have psychotropic effects, or they can be really bitter, and it discourages animals from eating their leaves. So cinchona and some of those other plants were often used as source materials for these alkaloids, because they're very much more common in tropical plants, although they occur here as well. Now vincamine, the chemotherapy drug that comes in larger quantities in that Madagascar periwinkle, also occurs in this plant, and a lot of closely related alkaloids. So this plant also has a history of being used to treat various types of cancers. And like the celandine that I talked about, it's one of the plants that we classify as a medium potency plant. So it does have some level of toxicity associated with it if it's used in excess, and it has to be used a little more carefully, which, as I said before, means that we put some restrictions on its use. Again, not usually more than 20 to 25% in a formula, and not usually more than 3 or 4 months at a time, uh, in order to reduce any potential buildup of those constituents and potential for toxicity. Because one of the things about alkaloids is they're very fat soluble, and fat soluble constituents are the kind that are more likely to accumulate in our body tissues. They get stored in the fatty tissues of our body. So like the celandine, this one is used as a potentizing herb to treat a number of different types of cancers, but different from the celandine, whereas the celandine then is more a liver-based detox kind of herb. This one is also a very good medium potency detoxing herb, but its action is more on the lymphatics and the kidneys. But nevertheless, it can boost the potency of a formula to treat chronic inflammatory conditions later on in the treatment, if a stronger formulation is what is warranted, and that often happens with people that have chronic inflammatory conditions that go back many years. Usually the treatment protocol for it could take years to treat it, and it often requires gradually moving up to stronger and stronger herbs to really go deep with those types of conditions. So again, it's going to be used for chronic inflammatory conditions, especially where you need extra emphasis on the lymphatics and the urinary system. Whereas if you needed more emphasis on the liver, you would be more inclined to use something like celandine. But where it really is differentiated from celandine is more in line with the white pine that we talked about, and that is it is a very powerful neural vasodilator. It significantly increases blood flow to the brain, and for that reason it is in any area where you're treating neurological conditions, and generally speaking neural vasodilators tend to be very good for depression, anxiety, stress. And again, especially because these ones are a little more stimulating, especially when part of what the person is experiencing is mental fatigue, because it tends to make you more alert. Okay, so mental fatigue, and depression, but also things like dementias. I use it a lot treating dementias, and even more serious neurological conditions like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, ALS, and things like that. Doesn't mean it's going to cure it. With some of those conditions, but it does help to control the system. It does help to control the symptoms, and for those really serious degenerative conditions like ALS, it may not cure the condition, but it does often prolong the person's length and quality of life. Uh, and this is one of the ones that is really effective for that. Another area that it is used for is vascular conditions. So again, things like hemorrhoids, varicose veins, things like that, but also more serious vascular conditions like arteriosclerosis. It's really effective for that. So again, lymphatics, vascular things, neurological things, and for cancer. Those are the areas that it potentizes, and those are the areas where it's most often going to be used.